Cold War drama. And I came to America. I realized there was a deep corruption in that. Ground zero in Hollywood. Entities, beings, in the unconscious. It's deep depth psychology. Nature doesn't publish retarded things, do they? People invented a fake religion, and then synchronous effects begin to happen. The world responds to the will and belief. Reality is not just this dead, objective world. In the depth of mystic practice, for the Easterner, he's doing it all himself. The Lord does these practices through you. It's not I who live, but Christ who lives and acts in me. It's very hard for the modern to sit down because you're ruled by these other gods. You've got all these plans and these goals. These are types of demons, right?
Illegitimate Scholar podcast. Welcome, Scott from Australia. You want to tell me like who you are and what your background is first?
The bona fides up front. Now, I don't actually do this anymore, but I'm going to articulate how I sort of entered this world. My parents were in the film industry. I became through many other jobs, became a film director and writer, commercials and drama. I made a Cold War drama Cold War spy thriller called The Defector, set in 1967. That had Oscar-winning cinematographer Russell Boyd was shooting it in an Oscar-winning team, world class. I won an Australian Directors Guild Award for that. I've been previously nominated. That's a very national prestigious directors award there for best directing. And I came to America. Doing stories, really, when you're starting, or at least what drove me into it was this thinking that the world is actually more mystical than it really appears in modernity, or at least wanting to. Films were a way, or that's what they gave me. Films like The Prestige. So that's kind of motivated me into it. I was in that industry, but I went to America after I had won enough bona fides to go over there to work. I'd won American screenplay competition previously. I was represented with an agent and all that sort of thing before I went. So I went over there, and this is when Trump was elected, right? So all hell sort of broke loose.
Originally, you mean like 2016?
Yeah, 2016. And so this is when wokeism happened. And started to appear. And even with the achievements that I had, I realized there was a deep corruption in that industry. It was completely, and woke well penetrated that before the revolution. And as we know now, the revolution's much older. It comes from the Enlightenment, goes all the way back there. But it was corrupted. I saw the corruption firsthand. And of course, being a white man, you're experiencing that incredibly, as you might understand from academia, that you're at a huge disadvantage. And eventually you just start to recognize, oh, I see what's going on here. You promised the meritocracy up front. But nevertheless, I'm a very high achiever, right? So I was still able to get the bona fides that I was able to get. So I went over to America. And naturally, I'm socially conservative. And so I hooked up with the conservative circles there. I made friends with people like... basically in the group that spawned out of Friends of Abe, which was a Hollywood group that Arnold Schwarzenegger was in. And the Daily Wire spawned out of that group. But it was a post-group that. And so when I was there, I just recognized it was to become completely degenerate. And you're already, sort of on your knees trying to get finance for things, and you're corrupting the work that you're doing. And then also you're going to have to make this degenerate propaganda, to make things even worse, which is what woke was demonstrating at the time. And so it's just something I didn't want to be a part of anymore. It was the revolution there was that's its pinnacle. That's its ground zero in Hollywood. And so you're just seeing how Luciferian it is. And so I began to look, because I studied philosophy at university as well when I went, and I began to look, well, what's the roots here? How do we save this situation if it's going to involve storytelling in some way? And so while I was in America, I was hooking up with a conservative group of friends, people like Michael Knowles, made friends with people like Paul Joseph Watson, Carl Benjamin. You might know those figures. They're in England as well. And I began looking at the depths of what we are, being an ethnic group, philosophically. And that led into deep philosophical research. While I was over there, I actually invited these English figures over to meet various conservative figures in America. And so that sort of generated depth in those relationships. But also the philosophical project spawned out of that, because some of those figures are quite philosophically developed. And so we began working on that, and I self-funded a project to look to the ground of what the Anglo-Saxon ethnic group is. And so in the deep investigation of that, because that has ramifications for all the Anglosphere, for America, for everything in terms of the roots of that. And so that involved investigation of the American Anglo, and then, of course, over in the UK. And so, and then just going deeper and deeper into that, you're entering the realms of esotericism. You're studying the great philosophers, people like Dugan, Alexander Dugan, when you're going into the depths of that, and you're recognizing that to actually experience or understand the depths of these things, you're going from a propositional understanding into a pragmatic and practical understanding. And to a moral, it ends up being a moral understanding, because you start talking about values. What are they? You're deeply investigating. That's axiology in philosophy. And then you go, well, where are these things? These values that make up what we are. Peterson always talking about values. What are our values? Well, they're nothing. They're just a concept, right? But it turns out they're actually entities, beings in the unconscious. It's deep depth psychology where you can actually see and interact with these things. But in the normal physicalist worldview, you don't see it. And so when you investigate it long enough, you're wondering, how do I interact with these things? How do we find them? You can anthropologically examine them as the end of the process, but it turns out that you can go into the depths. And this is what people like Nietzsche did. Nietzsche actually, all the great philosophers and the great theologians are mystics, really. They actually look at being and stare at it long enough until they disclose things, or things are disclosed to them from being, because what makes up the existential being that we are things like values. But again, that's just a modern articulation of something. And so he discovers the will to power, right? This is what the depth psychologists are also discovering, other drives. But they articulate it in a modern way, a modernistic way. And so then you begin examining also ethno-sociology of primitives to understand what perhaps we can get a clue of what outside of the degenerated worldview that modernity has become, how to get a clean interpretation of what being is, or this being that we are is.
Of human spirit, of the soul. Is that correct?
Well, you can just start out existentially, like Heidegger, right? Heidegger, and yeah, so we can go into that. But yeah, that's where I ended up in that study. But then going even further in depth, it becomes a reality investigation. You have to go deeper. And so then you end up at Heidegger, right? You're trying to disclose, you're trying to escape the psychotechnology that's built up that kind of corrupts the worldview. Because think about it. In the modern mind, what's this meaning crisis? What's this death of understanding? This death of meaning, this death of even contact with truth, it turns out. It's always someone else, an expert, that tells us what the truth is, some at an academy, but even they are just filling their heads with propositions and an ideological superstructure rather than actually looking into being themselves like the ancients did and all the greats did. Mm-hmm. And so it's trying to find and so it removed from a intellectual study to a deep practical one. Is that how are these things actually interacted with and disclosed, to get to the essence of things and the truth of things, not through research, but not even just through the surface picture of the world, because that actually, as Heidegger helps us with, that actually corrupts the results. And so when you're studying Heidegger, he's talking about, maybe I should just give a description of phenomenology. What happened with the phenomenologists is they were looking to get to the things themselves. They're trying to escape the interpretation of metaphysics.
What was this word?
Phenomenology. Think about phenomena. What does phenomena mean? Right. It's just it's the thing that's given to you, right? Because all scientific results and data from ethnology, all of this stuff is all filtered through this here being, mind. Mm-hmm. You never get outside of it. Even all the empirical data is seen in this here existential being that we are, isn't it? Doesn't
Right.
matter. And so that's right.
Sorry.
You can jump in. That's fine.
Yeah, it's this could lead into a whole nother debate, but essentially, humans are a creation of nature plus nurture, and the rules that we have, like science, academia. These are institutions, the medical boards, the bar association, governments that have a certain amount of legitimacy, but ultimately they're not real in a physical sense. They're real in a metaphysical sense. And our understanding of them and the way that we interact with them is guided through our nature plus nurture. And so it's the institutions exist. Somebody has a view of them, but then the way that you view yourself and the interaction of you and everyone around you with that institution is through this lens of a mix of nature plus nurture, the innate, the genetic, as well as the cultural. And what I often say for a metaphor like this is the first lines of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. So I think that at a certain level, as mortal beings with constraints on ourselves, not at least infinite in our current form, but with our current realm of understanding, anything, we're never going to reach perfection. There's nothing that is perfection, because everything is corrupted and changed and molded by what is the ultimate aggregate of our nature plus nurture, our genetics, our ancestors, as well as our acculturation or enculturation, everything around us that affects how we view things, which is also essentially, I wrote an article for a publication that has not printed yet, to my knowledge. Unfortunately, there's been a number of issues, but it's volume 5 of the Dissident Review, and it was about the root of propaganda and how propaganda can affect the way that people think. But there's the underlying belief systems that people view any propaganda they see through. They see it through a lens of beliefs, and those beliefs are rooted in some foundation. And that foundation can be with religion and be unchanging laws, or it can unfortunately also be it being chosen for you through consumerism, essentially. And they're not as mutually exclusive as people think. And I have more to say, but I kind of went down a rabbit hole in a rant, so I will stop talking.
No, that gives a good context as well for what we're talking about. Heidegger goes even further than that, though. Is that he puts everything up for grabs, even nature, nurture, everything, because everything is filtered through. Because if you take even the subject that we are inside the body or anything like this, if you take that for granted, you'll miss the phenomena that presents itself. The phenomenologists decide to do, right? They decide to simply say what's given to experience. Think about it right in front of you. That's all you have, because everything's filtered through that. Nature, nurture, every theory, everything. So they decide to put around this what they call an epoche, which is a bracket around the phenomena itself, no any theory about anything, and just what is given here. And so in that, what the phenomenologists do is they do a thing called eidetic reduction, where, say you've got what demonstrates this? You've seen the ballerina illusion, where it has the mind can jump between spinning left and right, or you look at a cube, a Rubik's cube, and you can, you would have done this in primary school or whatever, perhaps, or high school, where you've got a cube and it can look like it's the foreground or the background when it's just an outline of a cube, right? And you can change at whim between those two different interpretations, can't you? And the phenomena itself changes. And so eidetic reduction does that. It's how many different interpretations can we expand this phenomena to get to what the thing itself is. And so there are two methods of doing that. One is volitional, which is what we just said with the cube. You look at a certain place or you use your will. Another is called the hermeneutic, which is you have a narrative. So if you consider above that Rubik's cube, there's a block. You can make it look like a robot, right? Now that solidifies the interpretation when you do this, right? And you can just demonstrate it to yourself by drawing on a piece of paper. You can come up with a whole bunch of different narratives to make different interpretations solidify as facts of experience, though. So it means that once I give that narrative, I can jump between the two volitional foreground, background, but also, to me, I can make it look like a robot at will once it's been solidified. So there are two different methods of doing it. So that's what the phenomenal, does that make sense to you? Like, again,
well, I couldn't say for sure, to be honest. I think it does. I think so.
Well, this is how they're doing it
reminding me
anyway.
of the Trinity almost.
Yeah.
Is that off or?
It's just a method. It's a method of getting phenomena to disclose themselves in a different way. And so when you look at the actual thing, it will visually look like the robot, let's say, once you have the narrative in place. So there are two different methods of doing it. But the point is, the phenomenologists had even certain, Heidegger's teacher had a certain predisposition for the transcendental eye. Heidegger decided to go, let's use this phenomenological method on everything. Let's get underneath anthropology, nature, nurture, and do what the philosophers did and say, we're just going to go to what's given. Think about it. Look in front of you. The experience. What's given. Don't assume a subject-object, right? Because then you're going to lose what the phenomena is. And so, because we assume we're in our head, we're the subject and the object. That comes from Descartes. Cogito ergo sum. There's a bunch of psychotechnology with us right now. Not necessarily in our head, but it makes the world presence like it does to us. It's an interpretation. So there's a world hermeneutic, a world interpretation that actually, and what Heidegger works out, and I think what quantum mechanics also demonstrates, and a bunch of other evidence is, and what he begins to disclose is that this here being goes beyond just subject-object, that the world is also, that's what the whole phenomenological method's about. It's that the world that you look at, the way being presences to you is correlational. You affect the object affects the subject. There's something that reaches out between those things, right? The interpretation itself goes back and forth. And so
right. It's perception.
That's basically perception, though. But again, you got to take away all the priors of science anyway, because the scientific mind will still be thinking, oh, we're still the subject, though. We're still in the body. But as we're recognizing now, let me just give just a few, patter out some correlated evidence that is related to this that we see. Let's just look at the paradoxes of, well, okay, let's just start with cognitive science. A lot of cognitive scientists are talking about extended cognition. That means that your actual being reaches out from you to touch things beyond the subject. They talk about distributed cognition. And what's distributed cognition? Well, the tradition's understood this for a long time. It's, hyperagents. It's social organisms, you could call it. But what if they have a reality beyond just, it's between the heads, right? But then we look at the results, the paradoxes of quantum mechanics that show that in the double slit experiment that the observer is having an effect on, in some regard, on whether a particle manifests as a wave or a particle. You can just look those experiments up. In the journal Nature, a meta-study of the parapsychological phenomena was done. All the math checked out. Nature doesn't publish retarded things, do they? You know Nature, the journal.
Yes.
A meta-study was done above chance, the results of parapsychological phenomena, right? Published in Nature. It's not questionable. It's in the journal. That's another thing. There are other also
actual deja vu, because I had this almost exact same conversation with Graham Hancock when he was telling me about a paper that was published in Nature. Sorry, I shouldn't interrupt. Continue.
No, you're right. I'll throw it over in soon enough. You can interrupt me and whatever. That's fine. And so
it's so good. Like, you just get in perfect flows. I don't want to mess it up, and I do. I see it, and that's my fault.
No, it's all good. And there's also been experiments done, a Canadian experiment where this is demonstration of beliefs' effects on reality, right? So there's people invented a fake religion, and then synchronous effects begin to happen. The world responds to the will and belief. I can't remember the exact experiment, but Nick Land, the philosopher, talks about it in a dialogue I had on my channel. So you have to do some Google searching to find it. And then there were experiments done on species, where I think they trained a species of bird to be afraid of a red hat. single birds, and then
Right.
the species outside of it. You've probably heard of this one. The species outside.
I heard you
of
talk
it,
about it on Jay Burden. Yeah.
Well, he brought that up.
Oh,
but
he
that's
did?
another.
Okay.
He brought that up. Not even me. But that goes to speak to sort of the group eyes or group. Again, this is archetypes. It's behind reality that they're connected to. And so I'm just giving you, trying to help the audience understand that the modern presencing, not just the interpretation, the way the world actually looks to us. And you notice this even, you notice the power of this psychotechnology that's been with us since even Greek times, is there's truth underneath this that you can get to. And that's what Heidegger discovers, loosening the deep traditions. So it's even just the way, it's not just about propaganda. It's about literally object affects the subject. Reality actually presences to us, even in a physical way, based on these things. So that's where you end up. And then you end up in looking further to try, well, okay, how do we get out of this mindset practically to look to the root of things in this revolution that's been occurring? And that's where initiation comes in. That's where, well, this is what you're in deep religion and esotericism, right? And that's where I ended up with the research as a practicality, though. But even the audience will understand too, just a bit of phenomenology, how powerful this is. Just to practically, we're trying to get the modern mind into this to understand this. And again, the traditions always understood this. The more you go on, the more you recognize the actual tradition's description of reality ends up aligning with this stuff. But an example for the modern is you get on an escalator when it's got no power. You know, the stairs that, I don't know what Americans call it, that go upwards. There's this enormous physical pull when you go to get off it. Has that happened to you before when you've walked up an escalator that's not working? Yeah. And so that's just a demonstration of how powerful this interpretation is, just for the regular mind and to understand. And so what the ancients have always done to find the truth is not research based on other people's propositions, but is to directly concentrate on and stare at being that is given to them. And so this is what the great religious people have always done. And it turns out, but by doing that, a deeper level of truth and being can disclose and reveal itself to you. And this is deep philosophy, right? It has ramifications for everything, for anthropology, but also for politics. Because if the human being is more than just what the tradition describes him as, and what all the basic concepts of these different academic disciplines rely on the definition of the human being as rational animal, it's changed a little bit in some of them, but the basic concepts that frame everything that we do is this here being, and it's correlational. It gives form to it, to how everything even looks. But those basic concepts begin to shift, or need to, because they're actually keeping us in the dead world that we're in, the dead. And that's a lot of that is to do with the collapse of the West, and that's what we're really what I end up investigating. Is what will help with that, because it's an existential problem. It's not just a economic problem. It's actually the roots that allowed for everything that we achieved dissolving underneath themselves. Not just in a psychological thing, though. It's deeper than that. It's objective as well. That's what I've tried to sort of articulate here with the phenomenologists and Heidegger and various people.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of what you said. There's many different directions that I could go, but I think going more foundational towards, you're talking about a solution, but I guess in your own words, like what do you think that the problem is in the West? And I guess not what caused that problem, but what a main or the main issues in the West are as foundational level as you want, or different answers. Basically, when I ask a question, you can say whatever you want, and I'll be happy with how you interpreted what I said.
No worries.
That's
this problem is incredibly old. It's an old problem, and Heidegger is arguably the most important philosopher of this age. And what he discovers, he goes all the way back to Greek metaphysics, and it goes back to the Heraclitean logos. Again, all these things gives form, like I've tried to describe, to the reality, the presence. It's not just psychological reality. The subject-object divide. Heidegger has something he talks about called the history of being. And each major epoch, there's a change to it, and it fundamentally transforms us as well. But the problem of what he calls technical inframing, which we can see the symptoms of right now, right? The hyper-acceleration, the generation and the splitting apart, and the hyper-egoism. What Heidegger discovers
Who are you talking
is
about when you say that? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but who do you, like, with who specifically? Like people in the West?
I'm talking about all of us right now with technology obsession. It's completely inframed our lives.
So the global world order, or like the Anglosphere, I guess.
It's not a person. Yeah. No, it's everywhere. It's modernity. The way being presence is actually in every culture now, apart from deeply religious people.
Well, there were some.
That's the world picture. The world picture is what we're talking about. Sorry.
A global egregore, essentially, the global world order. Yeah, including they brought Starlink or whatever, the internet, to some remote tribes in the Amazon recently. There was some woman wearing a Harvard shirt introducing internet pornography to people living with Stone Age technology, and it had foreseeable results. But that's a separate conversation. I just want to see. Great answer. Sorry, continue. I know
that's all right.
Interrupted your flow, but I'm trying to get a foundational thing.
Fine. And Heidegger traces this problem of technical inframing that is modernity and how the world is for us, this death of meaning and also death of contact with truth. He tracks that all the way back to Greek times, where there's a split between what the Greek word, our word for technology, tech, comes from the Greek word techne. In their early definitions of what techne is, because the Greeks are defining what being is, right? They are cutting it up. They're analyzing being because they were flooded with primordial concepts. And we're very stable, aren't we, in terms of our logical, calculative way? To them, they were flooded with it. So they were just trying to make just a little bit of sense of everything that was approaching them.
In a Heidegger world as well, which I think has an effect on this. And I think that worldview is more it's more available to ideas like this, because the way I see it, and you can disagree if you want, the gods of various old city-states, these pantheons of gods were seen as sort of real. And in the Bronze Age, cities would steal the physical gods of other city-states as they conquered them. But sorry, again, I'll stop apologizing. I should. But.
No, it does. Yeah, just do it, and we'll just keep flowing. So, I don't know. I don't think they weren't real. Those gods that you're talking about, personally.
And I agree.
We can get into that. Right. They've just, as Jung talks about in depth psychology, those gods just now present as complexes, but to the primitive mind, again, their way is not necessarily primitive. We've just built up all this psychotechnology, but the way the world might be closer to actually the contact with truth, or they were probably in some ways closer to the logos than we are, but they're still paganistic in the sense that the fall happened. But anyway, Jung discovers that that what is subjective for us now was objective, because this is a psychotechnology that emerges from Descartes. Metaphysics affects reality. How metaphysics happened across philosophy, it's far more fundamental than any science or anything. And it actually controls how reality was. And that's what Heidegger's investigating. And as Jung is in the same way, Carl Jung is investigating the same thing. And what he discovers when he looks into the primitive tribes and looking back is that these are physical realities to them. And again, they are real. And we just don't see them in the way the world now presents to us. But as you look to the depths, that actually becomes available in initiation. But the point is, with this word techne, he discovers a split between techne was also art, connected with the art, and what it became, though, this techne, was man's mastery over the world that ruled him, and he actually had to match the terror of the world. And so he then became a terror with his techne, And techne is just a proposition. It's an exact crystallization, if you think about it that way. Logic gates, when you probably studied basic philosophy in university. Again, just logic.
I did.
Just
I don't remember that
clear-cut propositions, exactness of propositions. Science is like that. It's an exact written down thought. What Heidegger discovers is this techne, as it splits off from art and primordial being, it becomes a rigid technology to enslave the world, right? For man. But what's happened is, so what he's basically articulating is that the being that we're in is that dead techne. That is technology, even all the way back in Greek times. They invented technology, those propositions, that certainty, because think about it. You have an interpretation of reality, you write it down as a philosopher, the next person learns it, and they've just got this rigid techne. They don't actually do the investigation again themselves to have that primordial touch of the depth of truth. Do you know what I mean?
We would call this a social construction in anthropology. The word is now associated with like wokeness, but it isn't. It wasn't. It's a social construction. It's separated from the innate, the divine, like God. It's created by mortal hands, essentially. And this is culture in anthropology, essentially.
Yeah, so exactly.
But you're saying that the culture is a real thing.
Yes.
And you could pretty much agree with you, I think.
You could call it on our side, on the technical side, you could call it a egregore. It's a kind of a technical, rigid hyper agent. But on the other side, they're living, let's say. And this is where you get a divide between what is human logos and what is divine logos. And this happens. And again, remember, this is more primordial than any science and every data, and all data always goes through this human logos, which is this social organism. And it gives form to reality itself.
Right. Which is why we think we're more advanced than these nations of the past, because we judge that through metrics like GDP. We judge it through metrics that we decide ourselves are important through our interpretation of the world, right?
Yeah, and a lot of leftists try to use this to will do that same sort of thing. You see Alexander Dugin doing that. But there's a sense that it's not true, in that there is a fundamental truth underneath the pagan gods, because the pagan gods are all gods of existence. They're real, they're temporal, but they actually have no essence. There actually turns out to be, outside of this human logos, there's a thing which the tradition has always understood is the eternal. And so it becomes a temporal. It's scrap that last word. It's outside temporality. Well, no, don't actually cut it. It's fine.
Oh,
but
okay.
Yeah, it's fine. I just mean, I'm just saying, I'm editing myself for the people at home. Turns out that there's a place called the eternal outside of that, where truth is. So in a way, Christianity is, of course, more advanced because was prepared for by He who is. And so all the low pagan things emerge from temporality and existence. So those are the gods of existence. There is one God of essence, though, that reveals himself in... And again, I became deeply Christian. I'm a Christian mystic now because of this whole process I went through. I was not that before. I had the Spurg Scientology, well, I call it Scientology now, the Spurg scientific mindset, but that came into this through this deep philosophical work to disclose this, because I was trying to disclose, what's our folks supposed to do? And it turns out inside that human logos, that egregore we were talking about, doesn't really have that folks future. It's actually a living hyper agent, you could call it a living angeloi, that has that folks mission in it. Again, this is going into theology then. And you can disclose that, and that's what the Greek philosophers were deep at. They were right on the edge of this to discover it, right? And a lot of this is where Hermetic philosophy comes from. They received information from this logos, right? The logos did speak in other cultures. But I can't remember where I was going from that exactly. But I think we've led the audience into this pretty well of what I'm talking about. But the point is, it turns out that it's not just a research matter, that it, like I said, it becomes a practical matter, then a moral matter. You're trying to disclose the depths of truth, kind of like the ancient Greek philosophers were. You can only look so far back into Greek philosophy trying to find out what was this primitive mentality, what was this closer to contact with truth. Then you go, oh, I actually have to just do something myself. And that's where all great initiates, you're in Rudolf Steiner territory then, you're in Valentin Tomberg, you're in the Christian mystics, to actually look at being, to dissolve the egoic psychotechnology we've been talking about, to get to divine logos, divine word outside of human word. Because human word is, again, this social organism we're talking about. We're trying to get outside of that. And it turns out truth actually is a person, to my surprise. But if you look for truth, he discloses himself as a fact of your experience. But again, then you're trying to show other people how to do it. But it begins with that basic concentration practice. Concentration without effort is. And this is what initiation is. True initiation, at least since Christ came. It used to be a more collective matter before Christ, but Christ allowed it so we could just do it with him. But it's deep meditation into looking at being, which in a sense kind of dissolves it, you could say, but it's collaborative though. That's the Christian way. And so it's deep prayer, but also concentration. And I describe the practices of how to do that. I don't know how in depth I can go into today because it's very theological. There's a lot of scientific minded people watching this, but so it's hard to describe it for the modern, but essentially the way the world presences to you as a modern with all that psychotechnology we talked about, you can get out of that to have contact with a deeper level of truth, which is what the Greeks called episteme, and that's where epistemology comes from, the word. But episteme isn't just a research thing. The Greeks understood is that it's actually a deeper level of understanding where you could say your cognition or your being reaches out and contacts truth. And a general understanding is actually granted to you from that. That's what the Greeks were up to. And so you can do that in these practices and have a deeper contact outside of just a propositional one where you're getting information from the academies or whatever. A knowledge of, that's actually true metaphysics comes from that. It's granted outside human logos from the divine. The tradition has always been that. René Guénon, a great traditionalist thinker, you might know him. He's connected with Evola, understood this. Traditional metaphysics, this understanding of how things are, and philosophy actually comes from, is granted from the divine. That's what Plato was up to when he's talking about archetypes and such. So it's hard for the modern to understand that, but if you do the practices, it becomes more clear. And it's deeply religious as well, because it's a moral thing. It turns out, to my surprise as well, that reality is also moral. I know I've just been going on with this, but reality is not just this dead, objective world, but it's a moral reality. And you can't progress towards truth to have it disclosed to you unless you actually do the moral work as well, of forgiveness and what the tradition actually states, with the concentration I've been talking about. So again, I'm not the only one saying this. It's been saying by great thinkers that I can link. You can go to my, sorry.
You don't have to convince my audience, seriously. They're usually on board, and so am I. Even if I'm not fully agreeing with everything you're saying because I don't understand exact minutia of it, you're preaching to the choir here, so you don't have to worry. Yeah, so I guess on the Patreon, I have to ask you about psychedelics, even if not personally, but there's archaeobotanical remains of fortified wine from, I think, the Temple of Delphi and a few other places. They've been found in both pagan and early Christian churches in different places. But we'll talk about that after, because I don't think I can do that on YouTube. So I'm just saying that to remind myself. Yeah, this is great. You mentioned earlier Dead World, but more recently you were talking about Christian mystics, and I have somewhat of an idea of what that means, but I'd like to hear it from you.
A mystic is this word that actually people now use as an insult, but what it is actually, it's connected with what we're talking about with this episteme. There are faculties in the unconscious that are beyond what you could call the naive world senses that we're born into, which is the surface senses that we have. They're tied up with the will. If you purify the will, unconscious faculties that people like Carl Jung, who observed, by the way, these types of phenomena in clinical studies. So it is a kind of empirical research data. So these faculties have completely fallen asleep. They can be awoken. What does that mean? It's a four-pronged approach in contact with divine, with these faculties. Again, you have to go through this whole initiatory process with these practices. It's deep concentration, but what becomes available is internally what is called in the Hermetic philosophical traditional Christian esotericism, spiritual touch. What that just means is it has the immediacy of direct contact, which is, again, you can see how that's connected with this episteme the Greek talk about. Do you want me just to describe what that feels like so people can have a concept of it at least? So that is, it's felt sort of behind the eyes, because that's where you're doing a lot of your concentration. Again, this is just a location thing, though. So essentially, you kind of end up developing your whole body actually has a second touch, if that makes sense. But mainly behind behind the eyes and the forehead. Rudolf Steiner has talked about this. Valentin Tomberg, and I've directly experienced it as well. That's what's characterized as spiritual touch. Then the next one, which is a level back, you could call that the roots of the tree, right? Which is direct contact with the divine. And again, it's felt behind the eyes, you could say. Again, this is not going to mean anything to you until you actually do the practices, but you should at least be, not you, other people. The next is called gnosis, right? Which is, or spiritual vision, you could call it. Which is just what that word means is it characterizes a distance, something, so it can also be heard as well, right? So that's one layer back. But primarily it's that touch, but also with touch. And again, the mystics talk about this, like Saint Teresa of Avila, she calls it intellectual vision. It also comes with a certainty. You just have a certainty that of who it is, that it's truth. So it's not just these are deeper levels of understanding that of the human being that can actually have direct contact with truth. So you just have a internal certainty of what it is, or you can also interact with things that aren't truth and you'll know it's not. Again, I'm just characterizing the phenomenology of it, or what it appears on the inside. And so that's considered gnosis, right? And so over time, that gnosis is what's primary is again the spiritual touch, but the gnosis is a general understanding around all these religious texts you've been working on, a general enlightenment of understanding of what all those things mean happens. It's quite miraculous. But also you can see what Jung calls we could talk about the next sense, which Carl Jung, the very empirical depth psychology, calls it active imagination. What this is symbolic things are shown. It's like a transparency over normal vision, right? Where if you look at a gray wall, some people have something called visual snow. Like, can you see a sort of static there? I don't know if you have that. Do you have that? Where it's just a gray or white wall. It's like a static, or in darkness. Is it just black for you, or do you have some sort of...
No, I have the static, yeah. I was trying to think if you were talking about like in specific places or over the totality of your vision.
Yeah. That is active imagination. That is the spirit. That's actually where you're doing your attention and concentration. So we just think, it's neurological or something. No. That's what I thought too. It's not.
Yeah.
The tradition has always known this. So that's static we're talking about. That's active imagination. What eventually happens in that transparency we're talking about, that's static, which also we know it's on objects as well. What's disclosed in that is you can see spiritual phenomena in it, or symbolic. It's symbolic communication through it, but very real things in it. And so communication, that's another faculty that awakens in that. And just from doing these and the moral purification as well, but these meditations. And so that's the trunk of the tree, or what's called the magic, you could call it the magic sense, miraculous sense, because it's something that builds up this secondary vision that's connected with this visual snow I mentioned, that you have, and a lot of audience members will notice that when they look at a grey wall. And so that's the trunk of the tree in terms of the roots of the tree is the ground of truth, which is spiritual touch. The trunk of the tree is, and these are all connected to deep knowing, like what's the deep knowing of things. The trunk of the tree is that gnosis that I was talking about earlier, or the distance of spiritual hearing. And this last one, this is the what's considered the magic or the miraculous. It's also connected with know-how, because knowing how to do the practice as it develops over time is sort of granted to you. And so where's the last layer? This is connected to Hermetic philosophy. Is this a more technical created book, a propositional thing, a propositional philosophy? But what does that make? It makes the whole tree. So you've got the roots, which is spiritual touch, mystic contact. That's what spiritual touch is. It's mystic direct contact with the divinity.
Right.
And that's also connected
Speaking
to the
to
heart.
God, how some people might
Well,
describe
no,
it, right?
speaking is no.
Not speaking,
it's the
sorry.
That's spiritual hearing.
Or,
Yeah.
Yeah.
The most closest you can come to God is feeling, right? But it's also connected with the heart. When the monastics are talking about the heart, it's also in the emotive zone. You know where mood is. You can bring your attention to where mood is. That's what they're talking about in the tradition when they're talking about the heart. Look at the heart. So he also, because he's a person, he interacts with you also emotively. And so it's not just a touch, it's also being moved. So you can characterize that by movement. Again, that's mysticism. So that's just answering your question. But Hermetic philosophy is all these four senses together. The last sense is the Hermetic philosophical sense. So the metaphysician, right, he looks at nature and the scientist and deduces by abstraction the laws of nature. What the Hermetic philosopher does is he looks through nature to the things themselves and writes about and philosophizes about that. And so the dead metaphysician, which is what has caused this, he's just the bark of the tree. The Hermetic philosopher and the mystic is the whole tree from the roots. And so the last part of it is bark is nothing on its own. It's just the propositional theorizing of abstraction. The true mystic, if you're just the mystic and you just have spiritual touch, you're a kind of drunkard. You're not a true mystic. You need to be a Hermetic philosopher at the same time. You need to be a philosopher, like the true philosophers were and the true theologians are. And what that does is that's what this process does. Is what St. Paul's talking about when he says, "It's not I who lives, but it's Christ who lives and acts in me." And so he's interacting with you directly here from that mystic touch, but his grace comes and essentially moves your body in the practice as well, if that makes sense. Well, it won't make sense, but it will make sense for the more traditional minded.
Yeah, a lot of my audience is Catholic or some sort of other Christian, so I think they'll get it.
And so, grace is actually a very real, practical reality. You're always free. You're always free in it. You could stop if you wanted to, but it's like, if you're in a deep, relaxed state, in a passive, active state, God can interact with you through movements in your breathing. That's a deep part of the Christian mystic practice. But also say in a grace, a state of grace, you could call it, you'll just find that the will doesn't come from you if you're granted a grace. So say you're walking up a hill. If you're used to doing these practices, you can just relax your own will, and you'll feel the will of the creator. The effort, you don't need the effort to walk up the hill, if that makes sense, or a lot less of it. That's grace,
right?
Because that's an example of grace. Not always. It's only if you're praying for it and asking for it, right? But I'm saying it's like another being. This is what St. Paul's saying. It's not I who lives, but Christ who lives and acts in me. That's what we're talking about here. He acts. His divine will, and that's a kind of revelatory action that occurs in mysticism. So that you have another being with you always. Again, this is what's characterized in the tradition as walking with God, that helps you when you ask for it. Again, he's leading you and guiding you, of course, So it's not always exactly when you want it, because you still have an ego. But when you get through enough of initiation, he's a fact of reality, and you can ask this God, the Lord, questions as well, and you can get positive impulsions as well. Sometimes spoken, but that's quite rare for the God to speak in propositions, but he does sometimes. Again, because then he doesn't want to interfere with your freedom. That's the whole prodigal son story, is that he's very careful. It's all with your moral development in mind. But that answers that question basically. But it also leads into the second part of your question with the dead world. Well, what's happened is it's that techne we were talking about, the propositional superstructure that the abstract philosopher, who is not a hermetic philosopher because he's not doesn't have contact with the roots. It's an intellectual jugglery, but it's also cut us off from this truth who actually is a being underneath this human word or human logos or human social organism, like you mentioned earlier. And so that's the death of the West. It's the Greek metaphysics, the problem that was always at the ground of that, the Heraclitean logos, which is sort of human logos. Its ground, its essence is the will to power. You know how Heraclitus says war is the father of all. What he means is it's like war of all against all in evolution, right? That world led us to create this technology, techne propositions, and this dead bark I was talking about earlier, this abstraction from deduction, which is calculation kind of. It's a kind of calculation without actually having contact with he who is truth as a person. So that's what created the meaning crisis, is this death of contact with truth. And we know something's missing deep down, don't we? That something's missing. Something's dead in modernity. Where is it? What is it? What's the problem? It's a death of value. A value for things. There's no luster to anything. It's a death of truth itself. You can see that in the post-truth, people just pushing what their will to power is, can't you? And the death of the way, knowing what to do, or you could call it the good. And what are those?
The way
what are
would
those?
be the literal translation of the Tao, I think.
Yeah, but it's also Christ. I am the way,
right.
Truth, and life. Those translate into Plato's good, true, and beautiful. It's that Plato's good, true, and beautiful are kind of states. They seem like states, don't they? No. He's a being. It turns out he's a being you can interact with, because we think it's this dead physical thing we interact with. But actually, if we go into the depths, it's a person and a God. And so the good, true, and beautiful turn into the way, truth, and life. But as a fact of your experience, and that's what the mystic does. And then hopefully he philosophizes about it. And that's what a true philosopher is, and a true theologian is, who actually has the being with him of truth. And again, who is he? Christ is also the future. And so when you disclose this person, he can tell you what to do, because he's temporally, he's the authentic future. You've got a projection of the future based on your goals or whatnot, or what's going to happen, your predictions. That's a human logos thing. That's a limited human thing. It turns out that there's an existential place you can interact with. Who's he? That's what the Eternal's always been done, because he knows what the future is. It's God. He knows what the future's going to be. He's guiding us with his angeloi from his side of things, ingressing in it, but not interacting with our freedom, not breaching that. That's and so he'll tell you what to do. That's what revelatory action is. You can ask, and he'll help you, of course. But that's what mysticism allows. It allows a direct God is a direct fact of your experience that you can interact with. It's still a mystery, but it's contact, and it's impulsions. It's what conscience is. You know, when we talk about conscience, this feeling of, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or before you do it, it's a saying not to do it. We don't have conscience. It turns out conscience, we just have our prejudices, and we make calculations and judgments based on our character, heredity, and prejudices in modern world. In the ancient world, or for the apostles, conscience is actually, you ask a question. It's kind of connected to what Aristotle talks about when he says his daemon, is that you can ask. Or what happens is, and this is part of mystic practice, is before you do something, you'll get a positive impulsion within that recommends it. And after, a peace and joy. And so this is communication as well. because he's the future, you can trust it. You get confident in trusting this. That's what true confidence is. And you get practical intuitions. I don't mean women's intuition. I mean Bergsonian, like this is a deep philosophical intuition. You have to work very long and hard to disclose this. Just for people at home, they hear intuition, they go, women's intuition sounds like rubbish. No. This is practical intuitions, moral intuitions, and intuitions of the truth. They all feel a little different. But they're divine emotiveness. They get awakened. You have to do the work first to do it. There's nothing connected with your base experience of your feeling, will, and thought. You have to awaken
it's like
these
metaphysical
things.
It's like metaphysical muscle memory. Is that a good?
You could call it that, but it's a divine being you're interacting with on the other side. That's what you recognize. I know I'm sorry.
But training. No, it's okay.
It's just these are such complicated subjects. It's It has to be expanded. Training, collaborative.
You're training your ability to interact with.
Yes.
You're training your ability to interact with it. So there's a few things. 100%. If you're ready for me to,
I just wanted to finish off.
Go.
Just that little bit. The apostles had conscience, and conscience means with knowing. It's with truth. It's he. So you're asking him, and you get impulsions from him within what to do, and you can also ask questions. And over time, you recognize that he knows the future. That's giving you the answers because things are happening to you that are way above chance, way above chance. And also you're guided to places and you're asking questions that you would not, doing things you would not normally want to do, but when you do them, they're good for you. Things like that. And how could this not be a divine being if it knew these things? And again, it's only something that can be disclosed through the depths. So empirical science can't give you the results for this because they only have a generalizable. Using the empirical senses, it has to be repeatable and falsifiable. It has to be repeatable for everyone, but not everyone has these faculties. But you can at home. Everyone can do this, but not everyone has the faculties, so it can't be made into a Spurg science. But enough people have gone through it that it's true. People of health and saints. Rudolf Steiner, he tried to sort of make it spiritual science, but that's not a good idea because that can also rigidify it. But yeah, that's it. I think people should understand what I'm talking about there. At least get a concept of what it is internally. Sorry, jump in.
So obviously this is one interpretation of when I hear like you're interacting with the divine and shamans are a concept. I don't know how you're familiar with shamans, but a shaman in a shamanistic religion, and these often aren't mutually exclusive with other belief systems in most of the world, but that's a whole conversation about the anthropology of religion. But in any sort of shamanistic tradition, like Santeria is one example of this, but that's from the Caribbean, so I'm not sure. It's Puerto Rican. I'm not sure if you'd be familiar with it, but the root definition in anthropology is that they are interacting with some sort of other frame of consciousness, some other form of consciousness. And those in a shaman can be benevolent or malevolent, and they are interacting with that spirit world defined broadly in order to solve some sort of worldly problem. And this can take many forms, and the way to reach that spirit world can take many forms. But all of them, most of them, are even in regular science, the physiological effects of, for example, chanting or dancing for long periods of time or taking psychedelics. It does produce a physiological effect. And that's been seen in a clinical setting. But how does that relate to what you're saying? And also another example, and this is why I was laughing earlier when you said this. I read an ethnography a few years ago about American evangelicals. And this is the reason I said talk. Talk isn't really what I meant, but the name of that ethnography about evangelicals was called When God Talks Back. And evangelicals in American politics, I don't know how familiar you are, but they hold in a growing and hugely outsized influence in American politics. And the foundation of the belief is talking directly with with God in their conception of it. So it can be framed any other way, but that is from their insider emic perspective, that's how they see it when God talks back, when they're talking directly to God, and that's how they understand it. So what do you think about those, and how does that fit in into what you're saying?
This is really interesting. They both have problems. Let's talk about shamanism first.
Yeah.
Mysticism in initiation, think about the subject and the object as two circles, right? What shamanism does, you got these two unpurified surface things, object, subject. Shamanism divides the boundary, this is called nature mysticism, between those two things. And so and same with psychedelics, it's all the same thing. So this is what's called the broad way. What the broad way does, and there's a lot of other practices that are related to this, is they don't involve any type of purification. So what is in the depths of the psyche and the object are a bunch of temporal hyperagents who are, well, of course, the tradition understands exactly what they are. Demons, daemons, right? Temporal, all these different types of spirits. They might act benevolently at one time, but this is, you'll understand systematically the difference between these things. So those two things are purified. And even the Easterners understand this to a degree with their sobriety. And so what happens is, in the broad way, is that in their practices, and that you're lifting up all these things together, though, all the different contents of the unconscious, if you want to talk about that way, objective unconscious and subjective unconscious. This is not a phenomena that is only subjective. The world itself beneath what we see has a collective unconscious, as Jung talks about. Even Plato understood this but a lot of people have talked about this, right? So beneath that world, those two things are the broad ways that's lifting everything up. It's becoming more conscious of everything. And so you see this in Kundalini. Just Google Kundalini, which is a exercise done on breathing, but without any moral purification. There's all sorts of bone marrow disease, insanity. And even if you do this with LSD and all sorts of these psychedelic drugs, there's also, if you keep doing, there's all sorts of illnesses. And what are those illnesses? They're possessions by these hyper entities. So they're very dangerous. Some people got really lucky and the Lord saved them in that. There's an Orthodox Christian, has a channel called the Church of the Eternal Logos. He did ayahuasca. He's very lucky because it can go the other way. Or you can think of something. I just convinced
my best friend not to do ayahuasca. Well, I've convinced two people not to, both from a cultural understanding, but we can talk about that when we talk about psychedelics. But go ahead and say your thing if you want to about not doing.
It's the broad way, right? And it just opens you to possession. Again, this is what's called spiritual deception. In mysticism, there's a very careful thing. We have an epistemic principle, which means a truth criterion. We're not drunkards. That's being a drunkard. It's extremely risky. You can be possessed. There's no going back. And people like Aleister Crowley, people like Aldous Huxley, people will not be familiar with that name. St. Seraphim Rose, I shouldn't call him St. Seraphim Rose. Seraphim Rose interacted with Aldous Huxley, right? In the 70s, a lot of people came in pushing psychedelics. Aldous Huxley said, anything's better than this modernity. He said this to Seraphim Rose, who was also a great philosopher before he became a monk. He said this to anything's better than this modernity. And that is what it feels like a lot of the time. Anything's better than what we're stuck in this, right? And he came back and met him again. And he was only 38 and he was completely burnt out, destroyed, no contact with the spirit at all from psychedelic use. Again, it's because it's the broad way. Any positive story, it'll just lead you, because it's breaking open things. You'll just be sucked back into into modernity. Will still presence how it is anyway later on. You're not permanently transforming how modernity presences to you. You'll just have an experience of something as a memory of where you were, rather than having it transformed as well. But anyway, that's called the broad way. Now, what's ecstasy and ecstasy? Ecstasy is going to the depths of the psyche. Ecstasy is going to the heights of the object, the cosmos. Ecstasy means out of body. Christian mysticism does those two things at the same time. It's through purification, illumination, union. But the only way to do that is the three oaths: the oath of chastity, the oath of poverty, and the oath of obedience. And they're related to all manner of practices that are connected with this. Why is that called the narrow way? And why do other Eastern practices also are not suitable? Because they're connected with the will to power. They're connected with the West used all its genius, creative genius, to create external technology. The East did it internally with spiritual technology, meditation practices, whatnot. What that does is it creates the wings of Icarus. And what happens to Icarus? He goes too close to the sun and they melt off. The broad way we're talking about, an analogy for that is the wings of the bat. It's again, this is related to this will to power and egoism that we have, that we want to enact a practice and it achieves an outcome with no collaboration outside. And in the East also, the Prayana, I can't remember the exact text, look on my channel, but they're talking about it technologically, is that you bring the mind substance to stillness. But what Christianity is, and the West has, is that you do things, but it's collaborative. For the Easterner, those gods disappear. They just use gods as a tool to actually achieve the ecstasy or transcend itself through their sobriety. That's just the subject on its own. So it ends up in another kind of nirvanic delusion. This it's just for you. It doesn't have a saving principle, because the kingdom of heaven is eventually going to come to earth. It's not just the subject, it's the subject and the object, right? And so that's the problem with all Eastern practices. But I'm just, the narrow way, the shamanism and all that stuff, that's just so obviously a problem. They're all related in some sense to the will to power. You have to make a sacrifice of the intellect and your egoic lusts, and to do collaborative practices that achieve that. But I was talking about grace earlier. In the depth of mystic practice, for the Easterner, he's doing it all himself. The Lord does these practices through you. It's not I who live, but Christ who lives and acts in me. So that's the difference. And so the dangers: do not do any of these shamanistic things. What happens is spiritual deception. In the mystic process, the reason why we have a truth criterion and an epistemic principle, and why there's a tradition of saints that you can read, there's a whole epistemic principle that has these suggestions that keep you in contact with truth. It's because to the mystic, the devil can appear to the mystic too, and does. The will to power appears, right? So you need to know the difference. You need to learn discernment. And if you don't have that, you can be easily deceived, and you'll have illnesses down the track because of that. It might even seem okay to begin with. But just go online and search. There's probably Reddits about this. I know for Kundalini, I've looked up these Eastern practices and horror stories. So do not do them. And then you mentioned, what was the other part of the...
Evangelicals in America.
This is another problem.
Also they're expanding to Latin America as well. I was dismayed to learn that when I was in Mexico, how many had converted from Catholicism to Evangelical, which is an offshoot of Protestantism, of American mainline Protestantism.
Heidegger described this as sort of American Christianity and how it wouldn't help, because it's not getting to the essence of things. Firstly, for them, primarily, they don't have an epistemic principle or anything. They might hear things in their head, but you need to purify yourself. Like I said, they're your prejudices and the devil's right next to you. Lucifer is part of how your ego manifests. So it's like subjective seduction and is Lucifer, and objective hypnotism is Satan. So these beings are constantly around you. And speech is actually secondary. It's like we were saying. Primary is spiritual touch, spiritual hearing. These things are secondary. So you need to purify. Again, it's this case of purification, but they're a manifestation of modernity, evangelicals. So everything they do is framed in the psychotechnology we were talking about earlier. They haven't gone to the depths. They don't have practices that are designed to get them back to those depths and contact with He who is truth. So that's where the sola scriptura stuff comes from, rather than, the logos is at the ground of object and the subject. The Lord is at the essence, the bottom of the psyche and creation. You can go towards him as a practical matter. But yeah, these evangelicals, it's a manifestation of modernity. It's within this human logos. So I would just say, even offhand, is that it's not the right way of interpreting things.
I agree, if that wasn't clear.
Yeah.
Although not to your level of understanding, but I certainly had already disagreed, but now it seems even worse thinking about it like that.
And so it's like Mormons too. It's spiritual deception, unfortunately. The interpretation itself you could call spiritual deception, but really I'd say evangelicals are more manifestation of modernity. I think with them it's a literal interpretation of everything. So these things are deep mysteries. It requires so much. It's not, you don't just read and study. You have to do all these practices as well that the monastics are doing. I'm sure that evangelicals probably don't like the monastic tradition being Protestants, but I know that they are. I'd have to have a look, but I know that
they're not common where I live, but I wish I knew actually.
But I mean, look,
they're much more direct. It's very direct, personal relationship. I think that would be fair.
Well, yeah. Well, I'd like to hear more about their phenomenology. They have to describe the phenomenology of it, because a lot of the time it is prelaced in spiritual deception. But sometimes it might be authentic. But what they're teaching is not right in terms of doctrines. But so it doesn't mean Christ isn't sometimes in and with them and speaking to them, because he's always around.
Right.
It's just that you don't know what he's doing. You have to do these. It's so difficult. You have to do these practices to figure it out, right? But yeah, I don't want to say. Yeah, sorry, jump in. Now, jump in.
No, I just want to make sure that evangelicals, I'm sure there's some listening, that I'm not like putting down your religion. It's just, and I especially don't have as much of a understanding theologically of what they did. I read this book a long time ago as well, and that probably doesn't apply to all of them. But I would guess, and I wish I knew exactly, that their tradition and how they, how they teach speaking with God, as they would put it, is not developed in a way that me personally I would find satisfactory, or with. I assume you feel that same way.
Yeah, I mean, look, I should not make too much comment without actually looking at their statements about it. I'm just generally speaking. Right. So, but I just know that these are problems with modern Christianity and Protestantism. These are general problems of modernity that have warped things. Again, that doesn't mean they're not interacting with Christ sometimes. So, people are. I'm less okay with cultural Christianity or sort of these different types of modern Christianity than other people, because I think we more of us need to do that. Go to the depths to make our world presence collaboratively, allow our world to presence like it did for the apostles and the ancients again. And I know they're not doing that, at the least, but there needs to be an organized minority who do this for us to resurrect, the West to resurrect, to save things. So
is that possible?
An organized minority, it is, for an organized minority. I've talked about with people before is that suffering actually generates the impulsion to look to the depths. In a way, if Trump rescues things, that might not be so good for the neo-reaction. For people to actually go, I have to do this and put the time in, because it's a lot to get someone to actually sit there for an hour and a half or an hour. As the Lord said, can you not watch with me for an hour? That's what these concentration exercises are. Collaborations, you could call them, but it's called concentration without effort. It's Christian meditation. It's, again, nothing of this comes from the East. It's all from monastic tradition. So, I don't think you can save the West, but an organized minority can awaken to build an authentic ark, I suppose you could call it. And other people, if they can enter the leadership, perhaps that'd be all right. But what we really need is Christian theocracy from that organized minority that I'm talking about. Free Christian theocracy, free Christian monarchy.
Would you call yourself and this is an American term, which is why I'm asking, but would you call yourself a Christian nationalist?
I'm not sure.
Or would this be more of a caliphate of Christianity type thing, or a more soft power like medieval Catholic Church?
The system would be the state is actually an authentic organism connected to the true being. Again, so it's like a living.
Right.
It'd be more like.
But is that
entity.
state like? Is it Australia, or is it the Christian world? Is it the Anglosphere? Are you Anzac?
Like I don't have a very specific thing. I just know that the proper system should be. There needs to be actually.
You think that's the right way, regardless of the size,
Christian theocracy, a free Christian theocracy though. It's not going to. A monarch is the Orthodox understand that a monarch, an emperor with a proper church at the theocratically. No, not like a caliphate, because that's propositional. That's a top-down enforcement. They don't have an authentic contact with he who is, because it's, again, no other religion is true. They have some truths in them, but the reason why they're so good with their Lent and what they call Lent is because they're scared not to be, in the sense that it's top-down, right? It's, like you said, caliphate. So Christian theocracy won't look like a Islamic state at all. It'll look like a bit more like a Byzantine that was. But again, there needs to be spiritual political theory.
A closer real example of what it might look like.
Yeah.
But that's Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire.
Yeah, but it's not going to look exactly like that, because there's going to be all sorts of other things interrelated with that. And there needs to be a new spiritual political theory that relates all these things, an understanding of the transcendent self. And understanding broadly, because if what a human is, a man is, this has relation to anthropology. If that changes fundamentally when we understand the depth of things, when we do the deep researches that I'm talking about, beyond just scientific, but into the depths, like Rudolf Steiner did. If that actually changes how wide and how far the organism is, even temporally, then that changes political theory. And you can see political theory doesn't explain or behavior, or else we'd be at the end of history.
Right. Yeah.
So it has ramifications.
Kiyosaki is wrong on that.
Yeah.
Although he wrote a great treatise on political decay and creation. I'm a constructivist, but that's a separate conversation as far as political theory goes. I'm absolutely loving this. This is a great conversation, Scott. So there's two things that I really have before we go into the Patreon. But number one, and you can respond to this however you want, but it sounds like you're almost advocating for a second Renaissance, which doesn't have to be similar in its effect to the first Renaissance, which I would argue brings in the Enlightenment, which brings in the second topic that I wanted to talk about, which is the compartmentalization of religion or the compartmentalization of society in the West in many different ways, and including academia and the way we think about it, and also the idea that religion as the way, or whatever else you would call it, is more intertwined with everything that you do. Things that might be broken down through an understanding of society into economics, interpersonal relationships, but really, to me, religion should be, and it isn't in a modern lens, just everything that you do and permeating your life, and it should make sense and be understood as everything that you do, which also means that when there's a certain understanding of the religion, in my point of view, rooted in anthropology, that eventually that view of the world that we might call religion in modern terms no longer matches with it. It no longer makes sense given the human and physical geography that people are living in, through introduction of environmental change, of a growing political complexity to include more people, of the introduction of new technologies over time, or through colonization or contact with other groups. And specifically, I'm thinking about a anthropology case from New Guinea, where a cult that survived broke down. And I always talk about this book called Cassowary's Revenge. It wasn't a highly selling book, but it's one I bring up a lot. And the cult collapsed in the face of missionaries and new technology being brought in.
No, because the Renaissance was a good thing, But what it was, we were talking about the collective unconscious earlier.
Mhm.
The collective unconscious is sort of the domain of the will. And the way we contact with the collective unconscious is through what's called the vital body and the psychological body. This is Christian esotericism here. But these are things that have been disclosed also by Jung with psychological. That's what the collective unconscious is. It's something you can't see, but nevertheless it interacts with your life. And you notice it every day when some days you just wake up with vital forces. There's no physical explanation. You just don't have the energy. Because again, the reality is moral and there are hyper agents operating. So the Renaissance was that, is that nothing passes away. The world has a memory that are in these different bodies, let's say. This memory. That is what has been. It is, Heidegger talks about there's a difference between memory as what's past and what has been. What has been is this depth memory that's always there, even if we die, whatever, it's still there. This is where the archetypes are. Again, they're entities. But the thing with the Renaissance is it's connected to the Greek memory that allowed these things to reawaken. And I know it's connected with discovering documents and texts, but it's more connected with these reawakening of different archetypes of the past. And this is what Nietzsche, in that temporal space, again, there's an eternal outside of that, which is where the God of essence is. But nevertheless, there is this area of becoming in these different bodies that I've talked about. This is when Nietzsche talked about becoming. That's where that is. It's the collective unconscious. It's the domain of will, you could call it. You can't see it. You have to do a lot of practices to disclose it as a place, but that's where these entities are. And so that drove that Renaissance for those forces. So a Renaissance is sort of a rebirth
or renewal is the direct
I want to say
translation,
rebirth.
I think.
Resurrection's not the same thing. Resurrection is actually you're a new organism when Christ enters you. So it was good, but doing that again, you can actually see some sort of Renaissance happening. That's what a lot of Twitter is. People looking back to past texts and, oh, look at this, that, Greek thinkers, and that's going to be, no, you're still stuck in the same dead modernity anyway. You have to actually be resurrected by Christ from outside human logos. Because this human logos that we are, this human word, this human knowing space, that's what logos is. It's a word. It's a knowing space that we are. This space that we see around us is a knowing space where our existential father and mother, you could call it, is that this knowledge, right? Because it gives form to the space that we are, and it gives form in some sense how being presence is to us. So you can call it a mother and a father, but it's a sort of surface mother. And even when you go a bit deeper down, which is what Heidegger describes as what has been. That's good to be influenced by those deeper forces, but there's still dark forces there too that come back. Communism is a manifestation of Moloch, for instance. These are old entities that come back, but they're modern phenomena in human logos. How they appear, it looks different. It just looks like an idea, but no. But as we see, as cognitive science and these things improve, we sort of see that, oh no, actually, this is just how a mode that we can see of this organism. For instance, the theory of Freud, sex drives everything. That's Astartes. The will to power, Mars. You can see that in operating in sort of pagan resurgence, people trying pagan religions, which obviously I'm against because it's just not the truth. It's not the ground. I know you might have some people on from those people, but unfortunately, that's all right. You don't have to talk about that.
Your episode is going to release right after Tom Rousel's, who is a pagan. So yeah, this will come right after that. But sorry.
Yeah, I agree with Tom politically. I really agree with Tom politically again. But in terms of that, it's just, unfortunately, it's a reawakening of Mars, right? You look at Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner gave the pagan gods the greatest love you can think of, right? He lectured of them and expressed the great poetry of them. But he shows deeply, and you have to just examine them because it takes so long to expand the argument, that it's all a preparation for the incarnation. In the Germanic myth, you can see it in the god of silence at the end. That's connected with Christ. That forgotten what his name is, but he says nothing, and he's the one that kills the wolf and the snake at the end. But if people that are considering that paganism, again, unfortunately, it's connected with the will to power. And you'll notice that a lot of people that are in that world, they're always battling and fighting. That's where they drive their energy from. There is, and as Rudolf Steiner, please just read Rudolf Steiner. There's a particular book of his called Folk Angels and their missions in reality. And he fully goes into the details of the Germanic mythology and expresses why Christ is the culmination. The incarnation is the culmination of all those different pagan in the East and all those different things. And also read Valentin Tomberg. He explains what paganism is and gives it love, gives it the love it deserves. I'm not so good on that love, but they are much better than me. I try to be, but I just know that these things are dangerous. So, but they give it the love that it deserves. So, and show that Christ is the culmination of those things. Again, I can't make the argument now. You'll have to go read Rudolph themselves. I've given you a citation that you can go look at. But the Renaissance, right? So you see that a lot. And these old gods and some of them spiritual deceptions pop up again. They have new forms. Alexander Dugin's quite good at describing that. And you might also like this book too, which is The Anthropological Structures of the Imaginary. It shows how the collective unconscious manifests in phenomena that we know in terms of science, in terms of how the West operates and ways of thinking, like the Apollo, you can see demonstrated in antithetical thinking, Perseus. It's a kind of, you can see that again, it's like war is the father of all. It's connected to Heraclitus. It's antithetical thinking. Where do you see that? Rigid logic gates, but also new thinkers pop up and they combat the old thesis. It's the antithesis versus the thesis. But anyway, you have to read the book to see how these gods operate in modernity. It just shows how modern phenomena are manifestations of these hyperagents from the collective unconscious. Again, that's objective, by the way. It's not something that's just in humans. It's everywhere. So when I say that, but yeah, so that's what those phenomena are. I can't remember what was the other thing you talked about. I think that basically answers the
compartmentalization. But yeah, I think
I think that sort of answers
compartmentalization of religion. Yeah,
you see these. Compartmentalization. Modernity kills a lot of these things as well. But then we need to this sort of answers that question that we need to recognize that these modern things, capital itself, is an intelligence, as Nick Landis talked about. Who is it? Well, of course we know who it is. Capital is magic. Think about it. If you can sit on your magic carpet, and everyone begs for capital, don't they? It's magic, and it's satanic. That you still have to interact with it. You still have to interact with the world. All those things. But the problem is, and why it compartmentalizes religion, is that 90% of believers, whoever they are, even pagans, all these different people, well, especially pagans, will to power is their god. It's the desire to be able to affect your the being that you are on reality, is to affect your will, and capital extends all that, right? And so the God is capital. Even for a lot of 90% of Christians, your God is still capital. You're sort of pagan, and so the whole mystical practice and contact with truth and He who is and God of essence is a surrendering of all those gods of existence, which have modern manifestations. And so that requires a transformation from the will to power to the will to service of the divine. So you're sacrificing your low lusts over time, and you do this through the oath of obedience, poverty, and chastity. What's connected to the oath of poverty? Concentration without effort. It's poverty to the environment, right? It's giving the Lord an hour a morning. So you have to actually make God, like you said, you have to revolve around Him. He's not your tool. The gods aren't a tool to make your life better and to make your people conquer or to do any of these things. You're to do His will. He's got a plan. He's got a plan for you. This all starts to align with the tradition. It's deep metaphysical, but it aligns with all these traditional sayings. The only way He'll disclose Himself to you, though, is if you do that work about making you revolve around Him. That's difficult because you don't know what His will is. Unfortunately, though, you have to do this. Can you not watch with me an hour? You have to do the concentration. Then eventually you get these faculties awakened, like intuition we talked about earlier. And then you can start just asking, what should I do here? Should I do this? Should I do that? And then you no longer really make the decision. You don't calculate. And he knows the future and he's all knowing. So you don't have to worry. And so that's how you actually have God. You revolve around him and do his will. And then you also then begin washing feet of others. He washes your feet. These are greater beings than us. These beings, the angels, angeloi, the angeloi and the different angeloi of the hierarchies, they wash our feet nevertheless. And so we will then wash others' feet. And how do you do that? Are you doing exactly what I'm doing now, helping other people look to the depth of things? But unfortunately, it requires a lot more work than people first recognize. We just have to do this practice. And I've got these practices on my website. I've got it. The Greenwood Fellowship is all about that. It's very hard for the modern to sit down because you're ruled by these other gods. You've got all these plans and these goals. These are types of demons, right? In a way. That's liberal modernity. You create a technical system of goal setting and stuff. You've got all these talents though, and you've put a lot of work in. God's going to put that to good use though. So you don't have to worry. You don't have to surrender everything. I mean, you do, but he's going to put all that in the right direction through doing these practices. But you have to sacrifice first and dissolve, the will to power that's in you, because you're lusty and willful and you've got all these desires that come from earlier in your life, which is the first wine. That comes from primordial sin. You have to also do the moral work, not just the concentration. That's the oath of obedience and the oath of chastity. I won't go into the practices of that now because it's just too much information and too much time. But that is how you stop religion getting compartmentalized, because it is the essence of things. But you have to keep getting out of the modern mindset. And how do you do that? Really, it's exodus. You have to withdraw from society for a while. You have to withdraw from your friend group. You have to withdraw from these things to do these practices a little bit, because you're provoked at the moment. You're a provoked modern, and we want to become in a free collaboration with God, not to be provoked by modernity and technology, to live a life of our transcendent self, who is God and the Lord. And there's no more rewarding thing you can do to have that. You're never lonely because God walks with you. The existentialist, though, who obeys all these other beings, is deeply in need. That's why he's so lusty, because he's actually got this deep need for God at his ground. He doesn't know what it is. So that's why he's the will to power. That's why this will to grasp and at the expense of others. They are the wills that have to dissolve. They have to become wounds. They're the faculties. The will is actually the faculties we've been talking about. But you have to dissolve the will to grasp at the expense of others, the will to advance at the expense of others. That's the legs. The arms are the will to grasp and take and hold on to at the expense of others. The legs are advance and keep and keep your level in the hierarchy, whatever, at the expense of others. And then the will to power, more. It's the will to moreness. That's what Nietzsche discovered at the ground of being. It's the imperfect Heraclitan logos from Greek times has that at its ground too. It's this will to more. It comes from the fall. It's the snake. So, yeah, that's how you do it. You just have to put the time in, though. And most people will have a lot of trouble being willing to do that, but you can if you just. That's why I said earlier, suffering really helps. So people may have to suffer. The West might have to dissolve or fall, but maybe not. If an organized minority gets it started, then there might be a different way.
And that's how all of the social movements start.
So
it's almost more of the Renaissance was a rebirth of the classical era. Really, it's pre-Christian, whereas you're discussing, and that was for the modern era, the early modern era into the modern era. That this would be for, if it were to happen, it would be a resurrection rather of the early church in a way,
which is actually pre-pagan, because you got to remember in terms of how temporality works. I don't accept the whole picture of it's very complicated. Rudolf Steiner is very good at articulating how time works and how we came here. Christianity is pre all of it, of course, because we incarnate from there. We from the Spirit, right? So how, of course, the Lord says this: before Abraham was, I am. What does that mean? I am is a currency. It's a contemporaneous. So it means I am always before everything. So when the Greeks were coming up, it was always a logos. It's because of the fall, though, that this all happened. So I don't deny science. I don't deny the data. It's just how it's interpreted that's very complicated and I can't go into now. But Christ is before everything. He's contemporary.
Right.
That's why he says that. That's why it's not before Abraham was, I was. He says, I am. It means I am past, present, and future. And when you translate I am back into the original Hebrew, it becomes I will be, I was, I am. It's all three. It means all three at the same time. And that's what Yahweh also means, is that he is, he was, he will be at the same time. So, but it's true. When you interact with him, you find it's the truth. So, yeah, I'm just saying that he's actually before all that. That's why he says that. Because he's telling the Jew, I don't want to, that word can be dangerous to even say.
Right, even though you're not saying anything negative about them.
The Jays, the Jays, before Christ came, they were kind of, they're saying, in the bosom of Abraham. So he's saying, well, I'm actually his father. I'm the father of time. I'm outside everything. So, yeah. It's not just ethnic, it's outside the ethnic. And so, again, he's outside time, and he comes to save us. So I'm just trying to make the point that temporally, it's before the Greeks. And there was some sense, that's why they talk about the unknown God. Remember when the unknown God was the thing, when I think it was Paul who went to Greece? That unknown God, because they know that those gods aren't, they're sort of connected with the personal archetypes, the gods that they had, but their pagan initiates, they actually had contact with the Logos. So they did have, it was just a different time. The way initiation works has changed. It's very complicated since Christ came, because he came for a reason, to actually fix that whole process. But yeah, I won't go into that now. It's just a bit too complicated and extended.
I think we can go to the Patreon then. Where can people find you if they want to hear more?
You can go to
links below.
Yeah, no worries. Just you can Google search Scott Mannion, Mannion, or just go to scottmannion.com for the fellowship, Greenwood Fellowship, or if you just search it in YouTube, Scott Mannion, Mannion.
Okay.
And that's it. You'll find everything you need. And on Twitter as well, Scott Mannion. Follow me on Twitter there too.
Yeah. So I'll put the Twitter and the YouTube down below, and I'll Cleveland that, and we'll talk about psychedelics.